Tonight's video headline is dramatic, but the reality underneath it is more precise and more revealing than the phrase "all hell breaks loose" suggests. What we are actually looking at is a familiar and well-documented pattern in American politics, one that has played out repeatedly over the last decade. Protests erupt in response to political or social grievances in Texas. Donald Trump responds by attacking the legitimacy of those protests, and the resulting clash becomes a national political story. To understand what is happening and what is not happening, it is important to slow the story down and separate verified facts from rhetoric, amplification, and assumption. Texas has long been a focal point for large-scale political protest. This is not new, and it is not limited to one party or one administration. Over the past several years, Texas has seen protests related to racial justice, immigration enforcement, abortion access, gun laws, voting rights, and border policy. Some of these demonstrations have been peaceful and orderly. Others have included confrontations with police, and a small number have involved arrests or property damage. That range of outcomes is well documented by local reporting and official records. What is not supported by evidence, in most cases, is the idea of generalized chaos or statewide collapse. The phrase "all hell breaks loose" tends to come from political messaging and social media exaggeration rather than from verified assessments by emergency officials or independent investigators. Donald Trump's response to protests, including those in Texas, has followed a consistent rhetorical framework since his first presidential campaign. He routinely characterizes protests against conservative policies as dangerous, radical, or illegitimate, while praising or minimizing protests that align with his political base. This pattern is not a matter of interpretation. It is visible in Trump's public statements, speeches, and social media posts across multiple years. During his presidency, Trump repeatedly framed protest movements as threats to law and order, often without distinguishing between peaceful demonstrators and those who committed crimes. After leaving office, he has continued to use similar language when addressing protests connected to immigration, policing, or election administration. When Trump attacks a protest, the attack is typically rhetorical rather than procedural. As a private citizen and political candidate, he does not have direct authority over state or local law enforcement in Texas. What he does have is a large national audience and significant influence within the Republican Party. His statements can shape how protests are perceived by supporters, media outlets, and other political leaders. That influence is real and measurable, even if it does not translate into direct command over events on the ground. In Texas specifically, responsibility for protest response lies primarily with local police departments, county sheriffs, and in certain circumstances, the Texas Department of Public Safety and the governor's office. Texas governors from both parties have at different times authorized state resources to assist local authorities during periods of unrest. Any claim that Trump himself ordered or directed Texas law enforcement during a protest would be inaccurate unless supported by explicit, verified evidence, which does not exist in the public record. What can be verified is that Trump often publicly urges aggressive enforcement measures and harsh penalties for protesters he labels as disruptive or unlawful. One reason these moments escalate politically is the way Trump's language interacts with existing tensions in the state. Texas is large, diverse, and politically polarized. Urban centers like Houston, Dallas, Austin, and San Antonio often have political cultures that differ sharply from those of rural areas. When protests emerge in major cities, they can become symbolic flashpoints in national debates about culture, crime, and authority. Trump's attacks tend to amplify that symbolism, transforming localized demonstrations into national talking points. It is also important to address the role of misinformation. During past protest cycles, including those in Texas, unverified videos, misleading photos, and exaggerated claims have circulated widely online. Some posts have falsely suggested that entire cities were burning or that law enforcement had lost control, even when official reports showed limited incidents confined to specific locations. Responsible analysis requires relying on confirmed reporting from multiple sources and on-the-record statements from officials, not viral claims. When information is unclear or still developing, that uncertainty must be acknowledged rather than filled with speculation. Trump's framing of protest as existential threats serves a broader political purpose. It reinforces a narrative in which he positions himself as the defender of order against chaos. This strategy has been examined by political scientists and historians, who note that law and order messaging has been used by candidates across decades, particularly during periods of social unrest. What distinguishes Trump's approach is the frequency and intensity of his language, as well as his willingness to generalize from isolated incidents to entire movements. From the protesters' perspective, many demonstrations in Texas have been organized around specific stated demands. These have included calls for policy changes, opposition to legislation, or expressions of solidarity with national movements. The presence of these demands, documented in permits, public statements, and interviews, complicates claims that protests are simply acts of disorder. Peaceful assembly is protected under the First Amendment, and courts have repeatedly affirmed that the existence of some unlawful behavior does not strip an entire protest of constitutional protection. When Trump attacks a protest, the political consequences can extend beyond the immediate moment. Republican officials may echo his language, while Democratic leaders often respond by defending the right to protest and criticizing what they see as inflammatory rhetoric. Media coverage then amplifies the conflict, sometimes focusing more on the political back and forth than on the actual conditions on the ground. This cycle can make situations appear more volatile than they are, even as it deepens partisan divisions. There is also a measurable impact on public trust. Surveys conducted after major protest events have shown that Americans often hold sharply different views of the same demonstrations, depending on their political affiliation and media consumption. Trump's statements contribute to that divide by offering a clear, emotionally charged interpretation that resonates with his supporters. That does not mean his claims are always false, but it does mean they should be evaluated carefully against verified facts. As of now, broad claims that Texas is descending into chaos as a result of protest should be treated with caution unless supported by concrete evidence, such as emergency declarations, widespread curfews, or sustained breakdowns in public services. In most documented cases, protests have been time-limited, geographically contained, and managed through existing law enforcement structures. Where misconduct has occurred, investigations and court proceedings have followed, as required by law. The story, then, is less about all hell breaking loose and more about how political language can escalate tensions and reshape public perception. Trump's attacks on protests in Texas fit into a long-running pattern that prioritizes confrontation over nuance. Understanding that pattern allows viewers to assess these moments more clearly without dismissing legitimate concerns about safety or ignoring the rights of citizens to dissent. The facts matter, the distinctions matter, and the difference between rhetoric and reality matters most of all. The way this pattern unfolds also tells us something important about how modern political conflicts are sustained. Protests themselves are not new to Texas or to the United States, but the speed at which they are nationalized has changed. A demonstration that once might have remained a local or regional story can now become a national flashpoint within hours, especially when a figure like Donald Trump comments on it. His statements often travel faster and farther than detailed local reporting, shaping public perception before all facts are known. That dynamic increases the risk that early, incomplete information becomes hardened into political belief. Historically, Texas officials have taken a range of approaches to protest, depending on the issue and the political moment. Governors and mayors have sometimes emphasized de-escalation and communication, while at other times prioritizing visible enforcement and deterrence. These choices are documented in press conferences, executive orders, and budgetary decisions. Trump's rhetoric tends to favor the latter approach, praising strong police responses and warning of severe consequences for those he labels as agitators. However, rhetoric does not automatically translate into policy, particularly when the speaker is not in office. The distinction between influence and authority is critical here. When Trump attacks a protest, he often uses broad terms such as rioters, thugs, or radicals, without specifying numbers or distinguishing between participants. Independent reporting has repeatedly shown that most protesters in major demonstrations are nonviolent, even when isolated incidents of vandalism or clashes occur. Law enforcement agencies themselves often confirm this in after-action reports. Ignoring those distinctions can have real-world effects, including heightened fear among residents and increased tension between police and demonstrators. Another factor to consider is how protest responses intersect with ongoing legal and political debates in Texas. Issues like immigration enforcement, abortion restrictions, and voting laws have all prompted demonstrations that were closely tied to pending legislation or court decisions. When Trump attacks protests related to these issues, he is not only responding to street-level events, but also signaling alignment with a broader ideological position. That signaling is aimed as much at primary voters and party activists as it is at the general public. There is also the question of escalation. Research into crowd dynamics and policing strategies suggests that inflammatory rhetoric can increase the likelihood of confrontation, even if unintentionally. When protesters believe they are being mischaracterized or demonized, trust erodes. When law enforcement officers feel political pressure to demonstrate toughness, discretion can narrow. These dynamics do not guarantee violence, but they do raise the stakes. This is why many experts emphasize the importance of precise language from political leaders during moments of unrest. Claims about protests in Texas becoming uncontrollable should also be measured against available data. Arrest numbers, injury reports, and property damage assessments are typically released by local authorities after major demonstrations. While some events have resulted in arrest or injuries, these figures rarely support narratives of widespread collapse. Where data is incomplete or still under review, responsible reporting acknowledges that uncertainty rather than filling gaps with speculation. Trump's attacks on protest also fit into his broader approach to political opposition. He has consistently framed critics as enemies rather than adversaries, a style that appeals to supporters who value strength and decisiveness. At the same time, it raises concerns among those who worry about democratic norms and the protection of dissent. These concerns are not abstract. They are grounded in constitutional principles and past Supreme Court rulings that affirm the right to assemble and protest, even when messages are unpopular. Media framing plays a role here as well. Headlines that emphasize chaos or conflict can attract attention but may oversimplify complex situations. In Texas, where protests often occur in specific neighborhoods or near government buildings, the lived experience of most residents may be far removed from what national headlines suggest. That disconnect can deepen mistrust in media institutions, a trend that Trump has actively encouraged through repeated attacks on journalists and news organizations. It is also worth noting that protests themselves are rarely monolithic. Different groups may share a location or a moment without sharing goals or methods. Lumping all participants together under a single label obscures those differences. Verified accounts from organizers, participants, and observers often show a mix of motivations and tactics. Any serious analysis must account for that diversity rather than relying on caricature. Looking forward, the pattern suggests that similar clashes are likely to recur. As long as Texas remains central to national debates and Trump remains a dominant political figure, protests and rhetorical responses will continue to feed off each other. The key question is not whether protests will happen, but how leaders choose to respond to them. Calm, factual communication tends to reduce tension, while inflammatory language tends to magnify it. For viewers trying to make sense of these moments, the most useful approach is to focus on verified information: what happened, where it happened, how authorities responded, and what evidence supports claims being made. Separating those facts from political commentary allows for clearer judgment. Trump's attacks on protests are part of a strategy, not a neutral assessment, and they should be evaluated as such. In the end, the situation in Texas is less about disorder spiraling out of control and more about a familiar political feedback loop. Protests emerge from real grievances, political leaders respond in ways that reflect their priorities, and media coverage amplifies the conflict. Understanding that loop does not minimize the seriousness of unrest when it occurs, but it does provide context. Without that context, dramatic language can obscure more than it reveals. To fully understand why these moments resonate so strongly, it helps to place them within the longer arc of Trump's political identity. From the beginning of his national political career, Trump has framed himself as a figure who thrives on conflict. Protests, especially those that can be portrayed as disruptive, provide a clear contrast for that narrative. They allow him to argue that the country is under threat and that only forceful leadership can restore stability. This framing has been effective with a segment of voters, even when the underlying facts are more complex than the rhetoric suggests. Texas, because of its size and symbolic importance, plays an outsized role in this dynamic. It is a state often described as a political bellwether for conservative power. Yet it is also home to some of the largest and most politically active urban populations in the country. When protests occur in Texas, they are easily cast as evidence of a broader national struggle over identity, governance, and rights. Trump's attacks on these protests tap directly into that symbolism, regardless of the scale or outcome of the events themselves. Another important point is the legal framework governing protests. Courts have repeatedly ruled that the government may regulate the time, place, and manner of demonstrations, but it may not suppress them based on viewpoint. This distinction matters when political leaders speak about protests in sweeping terms. Calls for blanket crackdowns or the labeling of entire movements as criminal can raise constitutional concerns, even if they are not immediately translated into policy. Legal scholars have warned that rhetoric alone, when it signals hostility to protected speech, can have a chilling effect on civic participation. At the same time, it would be inaccurate to suggest that all concerns raised by officials about protests are unfounded. In some instances, law enforcement agencies in Texas have reported real challenges related to crowd control, traffic disruption, or isolated acts of violence or vandalism. Acknowledging those realities is part of an honest analysis. The issue is proportionality. When isolated incidents are presented as representative of entire protests, the public is given a distorted picture of events. Trump's attacks also interact with the broader media ecosystem. Cable news, social media platforms, and online outlets often amplify the most provocative statements, sometimes without sufficient context. This amplification can crowd out nuanced reporting from local journalists who are documenting what is actually happening on the ground. The result is a feedback loop in which rhetoric drives coverage, coverage drives outrage, and outrage reinforces rhetoric. Public reaction to these moments tends to be polarized. Supporters of Trump often interpret his attacks as common-sense responses to disorder, while critics view them as dangerous and divisive. Polling over the years has shown that attitudes toward protests are strongly correlated with partisan identity. That correlation makes it harder for shared facts to serve as common ground. When the same event is seen as either a justified crackdown or an authoritarian overreach, consensus becomes elusive. It is also worth examining how state and local leaders in Texas respond when Trump weighs in. Some Republican officials echo his language, emphasizing toughness and deterrence. Others adopt a more measured tone, focusing on maintaining order while respecting constitutional rights. Democratic officials generally push back against Trump's framing, stressing the legitimacy of protest and warning against escalation. These varied responses illustrate that Trump's influence, while significant, is not absolute. Over time, repeated cycles of protest and rhetorical escalation can have lasting effects on democratic norms. When citizens come to expect that protests will be met with hostility from national figures, participation may decline. Alternatively, some may become more radicalized, believing that peaceful demonstration is ineffective. Neither outcome strengthens democratic institutions. Scholars who study political behavior have long argued that the health of a democracy depends on the ability to channel conflict through nonviolent participatory means. There is also the international dimension. Protests in the United States, particularly in high-profile states like Texas, are closely watched abroad. When a prominent political figure attacks protesters in sweeping terms, it can shape global perceptions of American democracy. This is not speculation. Foreign media coverage and diplomatic commentary have repeatedly noted how U.S. leaders respond to dissent. The way protests are handled at home has implications for the country's credibility when it speaks about human rights and democratic values elsewhere. As with many political stories, timing matters. Protests that occur during election seasons are more likely to be politicized, and Trump's attacks often align with moments when mobilizing his base is strategically useful. That does not mean protests are manufactured or insincere, but it does mean they are quickly absorbed into campaign narratives. Understanding that context helps explain why language becomes sharper and less restrained. What is often missing in these debates is the voice of ordinary Texans who are not directly involved in protests or politics. Surveys and interviews frequently show that many residents are primarily concerned with day-to-day issues, such as jobs, healthcare, and education. For them, the portrayal of their state as perpetually on the brink of chaos can feel disconnected from reality. That gap between perception and experience is another reason why careful, factual reporting is essential. Ultimately, the phrase "all hell breaks loose" tells us more about political messaging than about conditions on the ground. It is a phrase designed to provoke emotion and command attention. The verified record across multiple protest cycles in Texas points to a more restrained and complex reality. Moments of tension, instances of misconduct, lawful protest, and institutional responses that are imperfect, but largely intact. Donald Trump's attacks on protests are a consistent feature of his political style, not a spontaneous reaction to any single event. They are part of a broader strategy that prioritizes confrontation and clear lines of division. Viewers can acknowledge that strategy without accepting its premises. Doing so requires patience, attention to detail, and a willingness to distinguish between what is said and what is proven. As this story continues to evolve, the most responsible approach remains the same. Focus on confirmed facts, identify who is speaking, what authority they have, and what evidence supports their claims. Recognize rhetoric for what it is and resist the temptation to let dramatic language substitute for analysis. In a political environment shaped by constant amplification, that discipline is not easy, but it is necessary.